The morning mist still clung to the stone bridge when Seraphina Colt crossed into Ashwood territory. She carried a single worn leather bag over one shoulder and wore a plain grey cloak that did nothing to hide how ordinary she looked. She was not a warrior. She was not a noblewoman. She was the daughter of a village healer, and she had been sent here as part of a peace agreement her people could not afford to break. The soldiers who escorted her said very little. They rode ahead and behind her like walls, as if she might run. She did not plan to run. Running was for people who had not already made peace with hard things. Seraphina had made peace with hard things a long time ago. She looked up at the palace as it came into view and allowed herself one quiet moment of honest feeling. It was enormous. Dark stone towers rose against a pale winter sky, and the banners of the Ashwood Pack, a silver wolf on a field of deep green, snapped in the cold wind. It was a place built to make people feel small. She straightened her back and kept walking. The great hall was already full when she arrived. Word had spread fast. Hundreds of pack members, from high lords to castle servants, had gathered to witness the mating ceremony. It was tradition. When a potential mate entered Ashwood territory, the Alpha's wolf would either respond to her presence or it would not. Simple. Ancient. Impossible to fake. Seraphina stood at the far end of the hall, alone in the open space they had cleared for her. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, studying her plain clothes, her village rough hands, the quiet way she stood without fidgeting. She heard the whispers start almost immediately. She did not look at the whisperers. Then he entered, and the whole room shifted. King Caelan Morrow walked like someone who had never once in his life needed to announce himself. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes the color of storm clouds, a gray so pale they almost looked silver. He wore no crown today, just a dark coat with the Ashwood crest stitched at the chest. He did not look ceremonial. He looked dangerous. His gaze swept the room once and landed on her. Seraphina met it without blinking. Something passed over his face, fast, like a cloud crossing the sun. His jaw tightened. His steps slowed, just briefly, just enough that the elder standing beside him noticed. Elder Dara, a small ancient woman with kind eyes and a spine like iron, turned her head slightly and watched the king with careful attention. The ceremony began with quiet words from the elder, old words in the old language that Seraphina only half understood. But she felt the moment the bond stirred. It was not like she had imagined. It was not flowers and warmth and music. It was more like a key turning in a lock she had not known was there. A recognition, deep and wordless, that settled in her chest and said, him. She did not reach for it. She simply acknowledged it the way she acknowledged most things, with stillness. The gasp that rippled through the crowd told her that others had seen it too. The elder's eyes went wide. The lords near the front of the room began murmuring urgently to each other. And King Caelan Morrow, Alpha of all the Ashwood territories, a man whose word was law, went very, very still. Then he laughed. It was a short, hard sound. Not warm. Not kind. He looked at her, truly looked at her, from her worn boots to her plain cloak to her calm, waiting face, and something in his expression became cruel. I reject you, he said clearly. His voice carried across the entire hall. Clean and cold as a blade set down on stone. There was no hesitation in it. No doubt. He said it like a king dismissing a petition. Final. Practiced. Easy. The hall erupted. Not in cheering, in shock. Pack members who had witnessed dozens of ceremonies had never seen a fated bond rejected. Not like this. Not publicly, not immediately, not without even a conversation. Elder Dara's hand moved to her mouth. Commander Ren Varsek, standing at the king's right side, looked at the floor. Everyone in the room turned to look at Seraphina. She stood in the open space, alone, with every eye fixed on her. And she smiled. It was not a broken smile. It was not a polite, pained smile meant to protect her dignity. It was something quieter and more unsettling than either of those. It was the smile of a woman who had already decided how this moment would end, and it had nothing to do with him. She held his gaze for a long breath. 1 beat. 2. Then she picked up her bag from the floor, turned around, and walked toward the door. No tears. No words. No scene. No plea. Just the sound of her footsteps, steady and unhurried, crossing the great hall while 500 people watched in absolute silence. Sorellen's eyes followed her all the way to the door. His jaw was still set hard, his posture still rigid with authority. But something had changed in his face, something no one in his court had ever seen before. It was not satisfaction. It was not the cool relief of a man who had gotten what he wanted. It looked, for just a moment, like confusion. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click. The hall stayed silent for a long moment after she left. Then Elder Dara turned to the king. She did not raise her voice. She simply said, quietly and without judgment, that, Your Majesty, was your mate. Sorellen said nothing. He looked at the closed door. Outside, in the cold courtyard, Seraphina set her bag down on a low stone wall and breathed in the winter air. Her hands were completely steady. Her face was calm. But in the center of her chest, where that quiet recognition had settled, there was a small, honest ache, the kind that only comes when something that could have been beautiful is wasted before it even begins. She looked up at the gray sky and let herself feel it for exactly 3 breaths. Then she picked her bag back up and started looking for somewhere warm to sleep. She was not leaving yet. She had been sent here as part of a peace agreement, and she intended to honor that. But she was also not waiting for a king to change his mind. She had never waited for anyone. And that, more than anything else she had done that day, was what would keep Caelan Morrow awake for the rest of the night. 3 days passed after the ceremony, and Seraphina did not leave. She had been given a small room near the servants' quarters, not an insult, she had decided, just a reflection of how little thought anyone had given to where to put her. The room had 1 window, 1 candle, and a narrow bed with a wool blanket that smelled faintly of cedar. She found it perfectly acceptable. She had slept in worse places during the years she had traveled with her mother, carrying medicines from village to village through mud and cold and roads that barely deserved the name. She unpacked her single bag with the same careful attention she gave everything. Herbs wrapped in cloth. A small knife for cutting. A worn journal with her mother's handwriting pressed between the pages. A change of clothes. That was all she had brought, and that was all she needed. On the first morning, she heard coughing from the room next to hers. On the second morning, she knocked on the door. The young servant boy who answered looked startled to see her. She was still, technically, the woman the king had rejected in front of the entire pack. Some people in the castle looked at her like she was a wound that had not quite healed yet, a reminder of something uncomfortable. But the boy was too sick to look at her with anything except exhaustion, and she was too practical to let that stop her. She spent the next 2 hours making a steam remedy from the herbs in her bag, sitting with the boy until the worst of his coughing settled, and leaving clear instructions with the cook about what he should eat for the next 3 days. Word spread the way word always spreads in closed places, quietly, quickly, and completely. By the end of the week, she had seen to 4 more people. A kitchen woman with an infected hand. An old stable keeper whose joints had swollen badly in the winter cold. 2 children from the Pack families who lived just inside the palace walls, both running fevers that their mothers had been quietly frightened about for days. Seraphina asked for nothing in return. She did not make a show of it. She simply moved through the lower corridors of the palace each morning like someone who had a purpose, because she did. Commander Ren Varsek noticed first. He was a tall man with an honest face and the kind of steady eyes that came from years of making difficult decisions. He had stood beside the king during the ceremony and had not been able to look at Seraphina when the rejection was spoken. It had sat uncomfortably in his chest ever since, a splinter he could not quite reach. When he saw her in the courtyard one afternoon, sitting on the same low stone wall, teaching the stable-keeper's grandson how to wrap an injured wrist, he stopped walking and simply watched for a moment. She was explaining something, her voice patient and clear. The boy was nodding, his small brow furrowed with the effort of concentration. She adjusted his hands gently, showed him again, and when he got it right, she gave him a smile so genuine it looked nothing like the polite smiles of court women, it looked like something that had just happened by itself, without planning. Ren walked over and introduced himself. She looked up without any wariness, which surprised him. Most people in the palace treated him carefully, aware of how close he stood to the king's ear. Seraphina simply said, "I know who you are," and moved over slightly on the wall so there was room if he wanted to sit. He Saturday. They spoke for almost an hour. She asked him about the Pack's border villages, not as small talk, but with real specific questions about water access and food stores and how the healers in those villages were managing through winter. He answered honestly, because there was something about the directness of her attention that made dishonesty feel like too much effort. When he finally stood to leave, he said quietly, "You are not what anyone expected." "People rarely are," she replied, and went back to her herbs. Caelan watched none of this directly. But he heard all of it. His castle had walls, and walls had ears, and the ears reported to people who reported to him. He heard about the sick boy and the kitchen woman. He heard about Wren sitting with her on the wall. He heard the servants beginning to speak her name with a warmth that made something in his chest pull tight in a way he did not examine closely. He told himself he was not thinking about her. He was thinking about her constantly. He would be in the middle of a council meeting and find his mind drifting toward the image of her walking away from him, that steady, unhurried walk, that soft click of the door. He would be eating dinner and suddenly remember the exact quality of her smile, the one she had given him just before she turned around. He had been smiled at thousands of times. He could not remember any of them. He could not stop remembering this one. He was short-tempered with his counsel. He slept badly. He rode out twice in 3 days, pushing his horse harder than usual across the winter fields, trying to burn the restlessness out of his body. It did not work. Lady Voss found him in this state and knew exactly what to do with it. She was beautiful in the sharp, deliberate way of someone who had worked very hard to be beautiful, and she had spent 2 years positioning herself carefully in Caelan's orbit. She understood his pride better than almost anyone. She knew that the fastest way to move him was not to push but to reflect, to hold up a mirror and let him see what she wanted him to see. "The servants are talking," she said one evening, her voice gentle with false concern. "They say the rejected girl has made herself very comfortable here. That she has won over your people with small kindnesses." She paused. "It looks, forgive me, like a strategy." Caelan's jaw tightened. "What do you mean?" "I only mean," Voss said carefully, "that a clever woman who wants influence would begin exactly this way. With the servants. With the lower ranks. Building loyalty from the ground up, before anyone notices." She tilted her head. "But perhaps I am being uncharitable. Perhaps she is simply generous." She left the thought there, like a seed dropped into prepared soil, and changed the subject. She did not need to say another word. She had learned long ago that with a proud man, you did not plant the idea, you simply loosened the ground and let his own fear do the growing. 3 days later, Caelan called for Seraphina. She came to his study without hurrying. She wore the same plain clothes. Her copper-brown hair was pulled back simply. She stood in front of his desk and waited, her hands relaxed at her sides, her face that same unreadable calm that had haunted him since the moment she had walked away. He looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "You will leave Ashwood territory by sunrise tomorrow," he said. "The peace agreement will be honored through other means. Your presence here is no longer required." The room was very quiet. He watched her face for the flinch, for the trembling lip, the welling eyes, the crumbling dignity. He had seen it before, that moment when someone finally broke under the weight of his authority. He was not proud of waiting for it. But he waited. Seraphina looked at him steadily. Then she nodded once, a single, composed dip of her head that communicated perfect understanding and absolutely nothing else. "Of course," she said. "I'll be ready." She turned to leave. And Caelan, who had spoken the words he intended to speak and gotten exactly the outcome he had planned, felt something collapse quietly inside his chest, something structural, something he could not name and could not afford to look at directly. He had won. He had sent her away. So why did it feel, standing alone in his empty study, like he had just made the worst mistake of his life? She was packed before the first light touched the sky. There was not much to pack. The same worn bag, the same herbs wrapped in cloth, the same journal. The room she was leaving looked almost exactly as it had when she arrived. She had never been the kind of person who left marks on places that were not hers to keep. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed for a moment, her hands folded in her lap, and allowed herself to be honest. It hurt. Not catastrophically, not in the way of something being destroyed, more in the quiet way of a door closing on a room you had only glimpsed and would never now fully enter. She had felt the bond. She had not chosen to feel it, had not asked for it, had not built anything around it. But she had felt it, and pretending otherwise would have been a lie, and Seraphina had never been good at comfortable lies. She stood up. She picked up her bag. She walked out. Elder Dara was waiting in the corridor. The old woman was small enough that she barely reached Seraphina's shoulder, but she had the kind of stillness that made you stop moving without quite knowing why. She looked at Seraphina for a long moment with those kind, careful eyes, and then she said simply, "Walk slowly." Seraphina raised an eyebrow. "I beg your pardon." "To the border," the elder said. "Walk slowly. The old eastern path, not the main road. It is longer." She paused. Sometimes the right things need a little more time to catch up. She turned and walked away before Seraphina could ask anything else. Caelan had not slept. He had sat by the window of his chambers through the long dark hours, watching the courtyard below without seeing it, while something inside him argued with itself in a voice that grew less patient as the night wore on. He had made the right decision. She was a complication he did not need. A bond he had not asked for. A woman who unsettled everything he thought he understood about how his life was ordered. He had made the right decision. He was still telling himself this when Elder Dara knocked and entered without waiting for an answer, the one person in his entire kingdom who had always done exactly that. She stood in the middle of his room and looked at him with an expression that held no judgment and no softness. Just truth, plain and direct as cold water. "Sit down," she said. "I need to tell you something about your pack." He Saturday. She told him the old prophecy, the one written in the pack records 300 years ago, the one about the Ashwood bloodline and the fated bond. She did not dress it up or soften it. If the Alpha of Ashwood rejected his true mate once, the bond would strain. If he rejected her twice, sent her away from his territory while she was still within reach of return, the fracture would become permanent. Not just for them. For the pack. A leadership without its anchoring bond would weaken slowly from the inside, like a tree rotting at the root. Not immediately. Not dramatically. Just a steady, quiet decline into brittleness. "I have heard this prophecy," Caelan said carefully. "I was told it was symbolic." "You were told what was convenient," Elder Dara replied. "Most people are." He was quiet for a long time. The candle between them burned low. "She is already leaving," he finally said. The elder looked at him steadily. "Then you had better decide quickly whether you are a man or just a title." She left without another word. Caelan sat alone in the thinning dark for exactly 4 more minutes. Then he stood, pulled on his coat, and walked out of the palace without calling for his horse or his guards or a single attendant. He went to the stables himself, saddled his own horse in the cold pre-dawn silence, and rode out through the eastern gate. He found her on the old path, just as the sky was beginning to go pale at the edges. She was walking with her bag over her shoulder, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, her steps measured and unhurried on the frost-hardened ground. She heard the horse and turned, and when she saw who it was, her expression shifted, not to hope, not to anger, just to something cautious and very still. He dismounted before he reached her and walked the last distance on foot, leading his horse by the reins. It was a small thing. But it meant he arrived at her level, not above her. He stopped a few feet away. He was not wearing his crest. He had grabbed the plain dark coat, the one with no symbols, no rank. He looked, and he was aware of how strange this felt, like a man. Just a man standing on a frost-covered path in the early morning, holding the reins of his horse and not quite knowing how to begin. "I owe you an apology," he said. Seraphina looked at him. "More than one," she said. "Yes," he agreed. He did not flinch from it. "More than one." The wind moved through the bare trees around them. Somewhere above, a bird called once and went quiet. "I rejected you because I was afraid," he said, and the words came out rougher than he intended, not polished, not kingly, just true. "Not of you. Of what you made me feel in the space of 10 seconds in that hall. I looked at you and I felt something I had spent my entire life making sure I would never feel. Something that made me less certain. Less controlled. He paused. I told myself that was weakness. My father taught me that. Your father sounds like he was a lonely man, Seraphina said quietly. Sorellen blinked. Of all the responses he had imagined, that had not been among them. He thought about it honestly for a moment. He admitted. He was one of the loneliest men I have ever known. Seraphina set her bag down slowly on the path. She crossed her arms, not coldly, just thoughtfully, the way of someone who is deciding how much of herself to offer and wants to be intentional about it. I need you to understand something, she said. I am not asking you to be perfect. I am not standing here hoping you will transform into someone else. But I will not be a trophy you reclaim because a prophecy frightened you. I will not be something you win and then forget to value. She held his gaze without apology. If you want me beside you, not behind you, beside you, then that is a choice you make every day. Not once in a dramatic moment on a cold road. Every day. Sorellen listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not defend himself. When she finished, he nodded once, and then, slowly and deliberately, he dipped his head. Not a king's acknowledgement. A bow. Small, honest, and entirely his own. Every day, he said. I understand. Seraphina looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then something in her expression softened, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that real things soften, slowly and irreversibly, like frost beginning to loosen its grip on the ground. She picked up her bag. Then we should go back, she said. Your people need their king. And apparently, she added, the faintest edge of warmth in her voice, their future queen has patience waiting. He almost smiled. You were already seeing to the sick. Someone had to. They walked back together, side by side on the narrow path, the horse trailing quietly behind them. They did not hold hands. They did not make any declarations. They simply walked at the same pace, close enough that their shoulders occasionally touched in the cold morning air. When they came through the eastern gate, the courtyard was already beginning to fill with the early activity of the day, stable hands, kitchen workers, a handful of guards changing shifts. One by one, people stopped and turned. Whispers moved through the small crowd quickly. What silenced every single whisper was not Seraphina's return. It was Sorellen. He walked through the courtyard and stopped at the center, and in front of every common worker and servant and early rising lord who happened to be watching, he turned to Seraphina and said clearly, welcome home. Not back. Not to Ashwood. Home. Elder Dara stood in the doorway of the great hall, watching. She said nothing. She simply nodded once, slowly, with the satisfaction of a woman who has been right about something important for a very long time. Commander Wren, standing near the stables, looked at the ground and smiled to himself. And Lady Voss, watching from an upper window, understood with quiet certainty that the game she had been playing was over, not because she had lost a move, but because the board itself had changed. Seraphina walked through the doors of the palace at Sorellen's side. Not behind him. Beside him, exactly as she had said. The calm she carried had never been emptiness or indifference. It had been this. The patience of a woman who knew that real things take time, that love worth keeping is not seized but grown, and that the most powerful thing she had ever done was simply refuse to shrink. She had not needed him to save her. She had simply waited to see if he was brave enough to save himself. And when he finally was, that was when the story truly began. End.